A Teacher's History of the United States is brought to you by $49sites.com. At $49 Sites, their dedicated in-house team specializes in streamlining the site creation and maintenance process, all for just $49 a month. Use the offer code HISTORY at checkout to upgrade to the Pro package for no additional cost. Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know that the original choice to write the Declaration of Independence was not Thomas Jefferson? It was, in fact, John Adams.
Did you know that John Adams thought it would be July 2nd that would actually go down in American history?
And on July 4th, not all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were there to sign it. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 59, the story behind the Declaration of Independence. All right, everyone, welcome in to episode 59. As you could hear in the lead-in, I am joined once again by my fellow history nerd, Mr. Bill Gorman. Bill, welcome back to the pod.
Always good to be here, Chris.
Oh, I thought you had something else to say. Okay, great. Yeah, it is. It is always good to have you here. I would like to remind the listeners before we hop into today's episode, if you can and are willing to support the show at www.patreon.com/teachershistory, that would really mean a lot to us. I'll be tweeting out the link, and it's tagged, pinned as a post on our Facebook page too, if you want to check it out there. And there's also a link on the website, which of course is provided by $49sites.com. So if you could support us in supporting the show, that would be awesome. It would mean a lot to us. Anything else to cover, Bill, before we dive into an episode that I'm pretty excited about and hopefully we'll be able to have enough vocal cord strength to get through? Anything else you wanted to add?
Save your voice, Chris. We need to get into this. This is important stuff.
All right, sounds good. So last week, Bill and I were on here talking about Thomas Paine, the T-Paine, and his pamphlet Common Sense and its impact on drumming up support for the revolution, both social and political. Today is our last episode before we jump back into the fighting, and we will be covering the event that made the struggle for independence official, the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, as you may or may not know, by the time the Declaration of Independence is officially adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, fighting had been going on for over a year. The colonies were determined to both value and defend their belief that the British Constitution provided them with natural rights, yet throughout this process, really over the past decade, according to some, these natural rights had been infringed upon, and without their ability to vote and take part in the political process, their natural rights as Englishmen were subverted. As I mentioned in episode 56, when the Second Continental Congress convened in May of 1775, most of the men were not in favor of independence and, in fact, favored some type of official reconciliation with Great Britain. For many reasons mentioned in episode 56, though, the representatives were slowly coming around, some of them quite quickly, to the belief that independence was the only reasonable option for the colonies. King George III's speech in Parliament, the passage of the Prohibitory Act, critical statements from Lord North and other members of Parliament, the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition, and the enlistment of foreign soldiers were just a few of the reasons why many colonists and colonial representatives were being pushed closer and closer to revolution. And of course, Thomas Paine's Common Sense went a long way to cement that belief for many who were still on the fence. While these events pushed more men towards revolution, the representatives in the Second Continental Congress had a very specific problem. They were all representatives of 13 separate governments, provided with very specific instructions to only do what they were given permission to do. And that didn't include declaring independence. In the spring of 1776, so we're talking a few months before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, members of the Second Continental Congress were determined to revise the instructions of the Congress, and they supported the idea of the colonies independently declaring independence. During this period, there were over 90 different colonial and local declarations of independence, and the idea of formally declaring it was gaining more and more momentum. The biggest holdouts for independence? Bill, do you know the biggest holdouts for independence?
It was
which colonies?
I'm going to take a stab here in the dark.
Okay.
An educated stab in the dark. New York.
Good.
Pennsylvania.
Good.
And Maryland.
Very good. All right. 3 for 3.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like we know something about American history and we do a podcast on it.
Almost.
New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland were the 3 colonies that were holding out the most for independence. You also had Delaware, New Jersey, also being a bit obstinate. The most influential of the group was Pennsylvania. And with stalwarts like John Dickinson in their assembly, it seemed like a long shot to get them on board. In anticipation of a draft on May 15th, John Adams presented the Congress with a preamble, which is normally customary for some type of project, such as writing up a draft of Declaration of Independence. This preamble did not pull any punches, just like John Adams usually didn't. He declared that King George III was not interested in any type of reconciliation and that he had hired 4 mercenaries to kill them, his own people, which was an unforgivable act. Would you agree, Bill? Unforgivable?
I think so.
Yeah, unforgivable. It stated, quote, "It is necessary that they exercise," them being the colonists, "of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed." One of the purposes of the preamble was to convince colonies like Maryland and Pennsylvania to overthrow their governments and send new representatives. But it didn't quite accomplish this, although they did do that later in June, the following month. With Congress clearly moving toward revolution, and at least according to radicals like John and Sam Adams, all they needed was for a colony to officially sanction the drafting of the Declaration. And on that same day, May 15, 1776, what do you know? The colony of Virginia did just that. Virginia's representative, Richard Henry Lee, received their instructions 3 weeks later and presented it to the Congress, proposing the idea that Congress, in fact, should move towards independence, and unsurprisingly, he was seconded by who? Bill, who do you think he was seconded by?
Your main man, John Adams, Chris.
Yes, absolutely. Lee stated that, quote, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved." And as you can probably imagine, tempers flared that day, and they flared so much that Congress could not come to a decision and decided to put off this idea of independence for a few more weeks until early July 1776, when cooler heads could prevail and they've had time to really think about the decision. Those against the declaration thought it was too impulsive and premature. Additionally, they recognized that this was a potentially huge decision, and they wanted to give the people of their colony a chance to voice their thoughts on it before they voted for or against it. Whereas those in favor believed that they had to officially break away from Britain if they were ever going to secure foreign support. And, I mean, in the end, what was the big deal? England, through their words and actions, had pretty much already basically declared the colonies were independent. Because tempers were still so high, though, like I mentioned, the Congress decided to wait a few weeks, talk about Lee's resolution again, and in the meantime, approve the proposal to appoint a committee to draft a declaration, just in case, when they revisited it, they did decide to adopt independence. And as a side note, you can sort of see which way they were leaning and what the tea leaves were saying. The fact that they created a committee, they more or less knew they likely were going to adopt it. Question is, can they do it unanimously? So they decided to move on to writing a draft of the Declaration, and they assigned Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Sherman, and Robert Livingston, nicknamed the Committee of Five, to produce a draft. Between the fiery debate over Lee's resolution and the eventual adoption of the Declaration, big things happen. I mean, keep in mind, the war was not waiting for these men. At this time, warships were sailing to both New York to attack Washington's army and Charleston, South Carolina, to bombard the port city. And, as we mentioned in a previous episode, the Continental Army is being forced out of Canada after their failed invasion of Quebec. Or, an anonymous letter to a newspaper at this time said, quote, "I would choose rather to be conquered as an independent state than an acknowledged rebel." This author even recommended that they call this independent nation, you guessed it, the United States of America. New Jersey, New Hampshire, Delaware, and Connecticut authorized, eventually, their representatives to vote for independence. Pennsylvania went as far as to declare their governor, William Franklin, who is the son of the famous Benjamin Franklin, an enemy to the liberties of the country, and had him arrested. That way, they could replace the government, choose new delegates for Congress, and authorize them to vote for independence. By June 28th, even Maryland, obstinate old Maryland, had authorized the vote. And this was after the Maryland reps were so pissed at John Adams on May 15th that they had actually stormed out of Congress when he was reading his preamble. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the Committee of Five. Appointed on June 11th, they quickly determined that John Adams was the best fit to write the document. But Adams, recognizing that he was viewed as a firebrand and likely seen as too radical and obnoxious, convinced the committee to allow Thomas Jefferson, a young, well-known, and up-and-coming politician from Virginia, to be the one responsible for the drafting. And it makes sense. Not only had Thomas Jefferson written numerous documents, which we have talked about on this podcast, but also on November 29, 1775, months before this, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend, quote, "Believe me, dear sir, there is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do. But by the God that made me, I will cease to exist before I yield to a connection on such terms as the British Parliament purpose. And in this, I think I speak the sentiments of America." When we come back from our commercial break in just a moment, Bill will dive deeper into the writing of the Declaration of Independence and just how it was put together. Right after this. What's up, everyone? Just as I mentioned at the opening of the show, we, of course, are sponsored by $49sites.com. And if you go to $49sites.com and you use the keyword history in checkout, you'll be upgraded to the Pro package for no additional cost. Their Pro package is made for those who want to get the most out of their investment in a website. Trust me, if you have a website or you are thinking of creating a website for your small business or your blog or your podcast or whatever it is that you want to do, I recommend you go to $49sites.com, use the keyword history, get upgraded to the Pro package because they take care of it all for you. And if you upgrade to the Pro package, you also will get an SSL certificate, Google Analytics, photo gallery, promotional pop-ups, Google Map integration, text animation, and so much more. Trust me, I am a current customer of $49sites.com, and it is awesome. It has freed up a lot of my time and energy to focus more on creating good content for you, which hopefully you're appreciative of. So go to $49sites.com, type in the keyword history, and upgrade to the Pro package for no additional cost. All right, back to the show.
This feels monumental to talk about, Chris. This is the main event, right? The Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, well, we always save you for the main event.
Yeah, that's right. The heavy hitter here.
Yep.
I mean, this is the document that pronounced these American colonies to be dislodged from the British Empire.
Yes.
Or
this is what we've been building towards.
Yes. I mean, it's the logical conclusion. Or as Sam Seaborn once surmised, it was on parchment with calligraphy and said, "Your Highness, we beseech you on this day in Philadelphia to bite me, if you please." Now,
I love all references to the West Wing.
Thank you. Now, of course, the history lesson we learn about the writing of the Declaration itself usually consists of Thomas Jefferson wrote it. Period. End of story. Maybe you will get that it was written in an extremely short period of time, like Chris said. Maybe you will get some of the neat timeline history of when independence was voted on versus when the Declaration was adopted versus when the Declaration was actually signed. While all fun pieces of historical trivia, which I, of course, love, these tidbits don't actually get into the substance of the document itself, which, to borrow a word, was revolutionary in nature, but perhaps not in ideas. What I aim to do in this discussion is to detail the drafting and editing process of the Declaration of Independence.
And it is more interesting than it sounds.
It is. I completely agree, because I get into this a little bit later, but we kind of just assume like this document just fell out of the heavens and that's what it was. Like Thomas Jefferson spoke it into existence. It's not true. So let's go ahead and dispel that myth that Thomas Jefferson was not the sole author of the Declaration of Independence.
How dare you?
Like all legislative bodies, there were committees and subcommittees and chairman of those committees and chairman of those subcommittees. You get the idea. Good old-fashioned bureaucracy. The Continental Congress was no different. As Chris said, on June 11th, the Continental Congress created the Committee of Five, a group of delegates who would draft a formal Declaration of Independence. Now, I want to spend another minute on the committee because I think it's interesting to talk about. The Committee of Five consisted of John Adams of Massachusetts, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia.
And I just want to pause real quick. I think I said Robert Sherman, and I don't know why I said. If I said Robert Sherman, and if you're listening to this, you'll be able to rewind it and figure it out. I can't because I'm recording live, but I'm pretty sure I said Robert, and pretty embarrassed by that because it's definitely Roger.
It's okay, Chris. I think the listeners will forgive you, especially after that Quebec pizza slice controversy.
Yeah, I mean, we're about 60 episodes into this podcast. I think they've realized just how uninformed I truly am. So that's fine.
So we'll pause here. Chris, does anything strike you about the composition of the Committee of Five?
Yes, I think it is in the you have a radical, an old statesman. You have a young up-and-comer, and then you have two other representatives from extremely important swing states.
Chris, we are on fire today. You just nailed that. That's right. It's the diversity of the group, right?
Yeah.
You got your New England rebels, middle colony members.
As diverse as 18th century America could be, because they are all white males.
We should clarify. Yes, they were diverse in terms of where they came from, colony-wise. Yes. Maybe not so much diverse outside. Yeah. But so those middle colony members, for the last few years or so, weren't totally sold on the idea of revolution. And a Southerner, Richard Henry Lee, from arguably the most important economic and political power in the colonies, Virginia. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say Lee? Well, that was Congress's first choice, but Lee declined. And then John Adams vouched for Thomas Jefferson instead. Now, we have talked about the turnaround time. The deadline was kind of tight. Congress wanted a draft of the Declaration for review on June 28th, a little over 2 weeks. All that said, the Committee of Five didn't actually leave behind minutes or an agreed upon accounting of how the drafting process actually worked. Today, we are left to piece this part of history together through varying accounts and reasonable or educated guesses. Let's start with what I believe is a reasonable claim. The Committee of Five probably gave Jefferson primary drafting duties. That's pretty self-evident.
Yeah.
It was John Adams that gave us the justification for the decision, as Chris got into, the political advantages of having it written by a Virginian and a Southerner rather than a radical New Englander, let alone someone from Boston. It demonstrated that support for independence...
Braintree.
Yes. Well, it demonstrated that support for independence went far beyond...
He's from Braintree.
Well,
from Braintree,
okay.
Not Boston there.
Excuse me.
Read a book, Bill.
Excuse me. Let alone, let me rephrase, let alone someone from Massachusetts.
There we go.
It demonstrated that support for independence went far beyond the radicals of Boston.
Yeah.
Moreover, logistically, Jefferson was likely the only one with the time to draft it. Adams was serving on scores of congressional committees. Franklin was suffering from a fit of gout so severe that he stopped attending Congress a week before the Committee of Five was even formed. He was.
I mean, he was really old by this point. Yeah.
Livingston was called back to New York shortly after the first meeting of the Committee of Five, and Sherman, after that first meeting, was likely only active in the review of Jefferson's drafts.
And Livingston was called back because Howe was sailing to New York to invade the colony. And the New York colonial government, understandably, was freaking out a little bit and figuring out where they were going to move to because they didn't want to continue to be on Manhattan.
So Jefferson was left to take the first stabs at the Declaration, largely by himself. When I started thinking about the prospect of that, I started to get stressed out. Like, I'm not writing it, but I guess I started to get stressed out. What a massive undertaking. What do you do in that situation? But I started thinking about it, and I actually have an example out of my own job. My customers are attorneys, and those folks always want a form or a template to start from because there is no point in reinventing the wheel. My company happens to supply those tools. Now, let's apply that concept to Jefferson and his drafts of the Declaration. Pauline Maier in American Scripture commented that writers forced to complete an assignment under great time pressure often look around for texts they can adapt for their purposes. And Jefferson managed to find two. The first was the draft preamble to the Virginia Constitution, which Jefferson had recently finished and itself was based on the English Declaration of Rights. The second was a draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It was said that Jefferson could also quote the ancient writers and modern philosophers at a whim. Jefferson's memory was up to the task of drafting this declaration.
Yeah, and I mean, well, another thing to keep in mind is the mindset around this, because today we think if something isn't totally original or if it's borrowed, that, you know, is plagiarism to the 10th degree and shameful, etc. And certainly as a former teacher, I recognize that there were many times when that is the case. But back then, it was because they didn't have just like scores and scores of libraries and resources. It was viewed as very respectable and honorable if you were able to quote previous politicians and philosophers, because that means that you were well read and that means that you knew it well enough to pull it off the top of your head. And so being able to do that actually was a way to show just how educated and well-read you were, as opposed to today we would see it as just, you know, lifting someone else's ideas. Back then it was not seen as that. And actually it was expected that a guy like Thomas Jefferson would rely upon previous politicians and philosophers for an undertaking such as this one.
Before this draft got to the Committee of Five and then the Congress as a whole, this was certainly what you could consider Jefferson's draft. It's all well and good that Jefferson had model documents from which to draw from. But would those documents fit his current task? I think we know that the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
Because he was searching for charges against the king And believe you me, if there was one thing these angry Americans kept, it was lists of grievances against the King of England. Meyer would comment again that Jefferson knew, as Congress knew, that quote, independence was justified only if the charges against the king were convincing and of sufficient gravity to warrant the dissolution of his authority over the American people. Jefferson's preamble to the Virginia Constitution, one of those documents he was drawing from, included 16 charges against the king. Not to be bested by himself, his draft to Congress of the Declaration bumped that total to 21. And on the Facebook page, we'll post the differences in those two texts. And throughout, we'll be talking about differences in the different documents that Jefferson was drawing from. These charges against the king can be divided into three groups. The first being that the king is a tyrant, or how I like to think of it, why are you picking on us clauses. One problem with this list is that oftentimes, the alleged tyranny was only directed at one particular colony, not the American people as a whole. Moreover, some of the alleged tyranny had multiple sides to the story, where the Americans weren't simply innocent bystanders. That is why Jefferson wrote this section in an oblique way. Examining them more closely would have been disadvantageous to the American cause. The second group are what I like to call the airing of grievances. And these should sound familiar to all you listeners of the pod. I'll list them. I'll list just a few. Quartering armed troops among us. Cutting off our trade with the world. Imposing taxes on us without our consent. This is the we didn't forget all those acts your parliament passed section. I'm reminded of the Bluth family phrase, we forget, but we never forgive. By the way, as they are written, there is no discernible ordering structure of those list of grievances other than they increased in political atrocity as you went down the list. So it built and crescendoed.
Mm-hmm. He was just building up the enmity.
And it crescendoed with the suspension of colonial legislatures. Pretty bad when you eliminated people's ability to speak for themselves. Just throwing that out there.
I would agree.
Now, the third group of charges against the king were those recent events that were tending to pop up in state and local resolutions for independence. This group could be considered the, quote, you think you're breaking up with me? Oh no, I'm breaking up with you, as they are mostly in response to the king's formally putting the Americans out of his protection, the abdication of colonial government, burning of colonial towns, and unleashing German mercenaries against them. It was in this third group that Adams and Franklin made the bulk of their recommended changes. And it should be noted, it wasn't like they were all then making their notes in line and redlining the document. These were just verbal exchanges. These were verbal exchanges of ideas. Jefferson would claim later in life that his text was not copied from any particular and previous writing.
Of course not.
We know this isn't exactly accurate. The guts of the charges against the king came from Jefferson's own writings, from other thought leaders of the time, including my man T. Paine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even his own. And John Locke, of course.
Of course. We can't go an episode of this pod without mentioning John Locke. Yeah.
The guts of the charges against the king came from Jefferson's own writings, from other thought leaders of the time, including Thomas Paine and, of course, John Locke. And even from his own congressional contemporaries like Richard Henry Lee. That is not to mention how heavily Jefferson leaned on certain philosophers for his preamble, which we'll get to later. While it is fair to say at the time the charges against the king were the most important portion of the Declaration, in modern times the Declaration's preamble has become the signifier of this being a truly revolutionary document. We must understand one thing, though, that while revolutionary for a country, a collective people, to declare independence based on unalienable rights, natural law, and self-evident truths, those ideas had been in the political lexicon for years. Richard Henry Lee would say that Jefferson copied the Declaration from Locke's treatise on government, which, if listeners of the pod will recall, I believe Bill Gorman also said such a thing on the episode on the Enlightenment and its effect on the Americans. So for what that's worth.
It would not be the first time that someone got you confused with one Mr. Richard Henry
Thank you,
Lee.
Chris. Sometimes we just don't get the acknowledgement we deserve on this podcast.
I agree. Well, that's why we have to shamelessly beg for it.
John Adams would write that there was, quote, not an idea in it, but what had been hackneyed in Congress 2 years before. Jefferson would defend himself through the ages on whether he had gathered his ideas from reading or reflection, saying, I do not know. I know only that I turned to neither book nor pamphlet while writing it. I don't know, right? I don't know.
There you go. It doesn't sound like plagiarism to me. Not plagiarism if you already had it memorized.
That's right. The contemporary text most important to Jefferson for the preamble was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, as written by fellow Virginian George Mason. The final version was published on June 12th, one day after the Committee of Five was appointed. Odds are that either the Committee of Five requested an incorporation of like language into the Declaration, or Jefferson simply did it on his own. Jefferson's preamble lays the foundation for why the subsequent list of grievances offends the natural law and those self-evident truths of self-governance. This wasn't puffery. Rather, this was an argument about the fundamental authority of government and the British kings lacking it. One of the reasons why the Declaration and Mason's writing slightly before it were so impactful was because it was using language that was familiar to colonial readers. Those Americans read the phrase, all men are born free, decades before Jefferson wrote them in the Declaration. So why a preamble at all? There was a reason why Jefferson and the committee were making the argument about the authority of government. In this case, the lack of authority the illegitimate British government had over the American colonies. It was an attempt to elicit foreign aid, partly, most notably from the French, a longtime foil of the British. I recall my U.S. foreign policy professor once saying, what is the fastest way for a nation to gain legitimacy? Have a legitimate nation recognize your sovereignty. That said, the Declaration's preamble was also clearly targeted at the domestic audience. It had practical uses. It provided a tool to formally announce independence to the people. It was sent to state assemblies, congresses, conventions, and to the commanders of the Continental Army to be read so as to evoke a widespread sense or call to nationhood. It is in this preamble that we get when in the course of human events, leading a single sentence meant to convey a sense of epic importance. This is your attention grabber. Jefferson then turns to those self-evident truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You may recall Locke's natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changes the last to the pursuit of happiness, which at the time was likely tied to the idea of safety and security. Meyer writes that it would also have been keeping with the biblical phrase colonists often cited of being at peace under their vine and fig tree, with none to make them afraid. I can think of no better example of that in practice than One Last Time from Hamilton.
The scripture says, everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. They'll be safe in the nation we've made. I want to sit under my own vine and fig tree, a moment alone in the shade. This nation we've made one last time.
Jefferson even wrote a section regarding their British brethren, which essentially amounted to, come on, man. We warned you this was coming. We appealed to you in each way you allowed us to, but it fell on the deaf ear of British justice. Jefferson, with some notes and help from Adams and Franklin, turned in that draft of the Declaration. Then, on July 2nd, the Congress resolved itself, the Committee of the Whole, to consider that draft of the Declaration.
And he had turned that in on June 28th.
Correct.
And the whole Congress spent a couple days reading it over, shortening it, taking out some of the more fiery language.
Getting into that right quick.
Okay, my bad. Putting the old cart in front of the horse there.
And you make a good point, Chris, because it was here that the Jefferson draft ended. This became a document of a committee once it entered the full Congress. New Hampshire delegate Josiah Bartlett said the draft declaration was, quote, a pretty good one. The Committee of the Whole made some stylistic changes.
What a pain in the ass Josiah is. I mean, seriously. Like, what did he do? I mean, how insecure was that man?
Maybe he was
pretty good.
He was lowering expectations kind of thing to exceed them, going forward.
Yeah.
So the Committee of the Whole made some stylistic changes, some syntax changes, and some lexicon changes. For example, inherent and inalienable rights became certain inalienable rights. Most often, the Committee of the Whole actually tempered the more extreme language of the Jefferson draft. For example, instead of expunging the former system of government, they would alter it. Perhaps the most notable wholesale change the Committee of the Whole made was to eliminate Jefferson's passage on the slave trade, which was mostly targeted at the king for trying to turn the American slaves against their subjugators. Jefferson claimed this removal was to keep South Carolina and Georgia happy. This dance with the devil would forever undercut and undermine the assertion there were inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which while themselves owning slaves. Politics are ugly. The machinations of who wins and who loses in the struggle for independence is uglier. But the systematic subjugation of people by the institution of slavery was the ugliest, and the Committee of the Whole did not undertake to correct that glaring contradiction between words and actions.
Yeah, they likely did not think it was worth. It wasn't worth it at that time in that moment, which is, disappointing to say the least.
Context obviously hugely important.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think they've made some strategic decisions by removing that passage that Jefferson had written. Revision after revision, edit after edit, Jefferson saw his draft become a document of the Committee of the Whole. But on July 4th, the Committee of the Whole agreed upon an official version of the Declaration, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Very good job. Very good job. And I a couple things. One, I appreciate your editorializing. Two, I don't appreciate all your Thomas Jefferson hate. Did not realize you're such a TJ hater. You're just a dirty, dirty Federalist, but that's okay. That's fine. I'll forgive you for it. I mean, it's not like he had his own dollar bill. Oh, wait, he did. The $2 bill. Yeah, what have you done? Okay, back up, Bill. So anyway, the Declaration, after it had been edited by Congress, as Bill mentioned, it was then put up for a vote on July 2nd. And on July 2nd, the representatives, all but those from New York, voted for moving forward with independence because those from New York had been called away from Congress due to the impending fighting in the New York colony. John Dickinson from Pennsylvania was still an ardent opponent because he didn't think the timing was right, so he abstained from voting to allow Pennsylvania to vote in favor of declaration because he recognized he was on the wrong end of the momentum and wanted to just get out of the way. In the end, while there were men in the room who disagreed with the timing or the manner with which independence was being declared, no one adamantly believed that independence was not the obvious next step for this burgeoning nation. In a victorious mood, John Adams wrote what is now an incredibly famous letter home to his wife Abigail, stating that July 2nd, 1776 would go down in the history books. He said, quote, I am apt to believe that Independence Day, July 2nd, will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. So close. So close. Only 2 days off. On July 4th, 1776, the document was officially signed. The most famous signature is, of course, that of one Mr. John Hancock, the president of the Congress. Two future U.S. presidents, in John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, although Bill hates Thomas Jefferson apparently, both signed the Declaration. There are oral histories of the conversation during the signing, usually referencing Hancock, making it known to everyone how gutsy he was for signing so flamboyantly. Additionally, there is a common quote that is passed around in which John Hancock supposedly said that Congress, having signed the Declaration, must now, quote, all hang together. And Benjamin Franklin replied, quote, yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately. But that quote wasn't actually written down till well into the 19th century, so who knows if that actually happened. But it's a good quote, so you can run with it if you want. No harm, no foul. Additionally, there's reason to believe that all 56 men did not sign the Declaration on July 4th, as some of the men were not even present on July 4th. Many historians believe a majority signed it on the 4th, and the rest likely signed it on August 2nd, and a lot of historians have spent a lot of time arguing over this with no real clear decision on exactly what happened, because there's no way to know. So we'll just leave it at that. The Declaration was immediately sent to a print shop, and broadsides were printed and distributed widely the next day. John Hancock sent one to George Washington and told him to read it nice and loud to his soldiers. In an expected turn of events, colonists throughout North America rejoiced in the Declaration. In many cities they rioted and tore down statues and symbols of royal authority, notably a large statue of King George in New York City that was then melted down to make musket balls. While the Declaration was a monumental document, it wasn't treated as such immediately after the signing. Early celebrations of Independence Day didn't really focus on the document itself until much later. But interest in the Declaration began to grow in the 1790s when the Democratic Republican Party emerged with none other than Thomas Jefferson as their leader. The writing of the Declaration was all of a sudden very important now, and the man who wrote it must have been some type of political god on earth.
A little self-serving, wouldn't you agree?
The writing of the Declaration was used to support his bid for the presidency, which he won twice, Bill, and increased his political exposure. Following the War of 1812, when all of America was riding the wave of nationalism, it was given renewed attention, especially with the famous painting, John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, which was commissioned to be painted by Congress in 1817, which we will also put up on the Facebook page. I'm sure you will recognize it. Over time, understandably, the Declaration of Independence has had a lot of influence on other countries during times of revolution, most notably right after the American Revolution with the French. The Declaration of Independence was also heavily referenced for seemingly obvious reasons during the abolitionist movement, the Civil War, and women's suffrage, which are all things, of course, we will get to on this podcast. Any final thoughts from you, Bill, before we sign off?
Yeah, I don't hate Thomas Jefferson. Let me make this clear. Like, he's a complicated individual. This was a complicated document.
Yeah.
And
I just like to give you a hard time.
And it's full. It is full of contradictions, and we'll get into the most glaring one as we move forward in American history. But we're actually recording this shortly after the funeral of Senator John McCain, and I think President Obama actually spoke in a eulogy to what the essence of what the Declaration was, even in its flaws and contradictions, that we were telling this king it's not what bloodline we came from, not what our last name was, not what we look like, not where our parents came from or how recently they arrived, that this was something different, that we were reclaiming a natural right, and that the king had no rights or privilege to subjugate us any longer. And I think for all its flaws, I think President Obama actually summed it up pretty good, what the essence of this document truly was.
That's awesome. Very good, Bill. Good trying to convince us you don't hate Thomas Jefferson. I don't buy it. But no, I think that's a great point, Bill. And I know I have to run. I know you have to run. We're recording this on Labor Day weekend. So, Bill, thank you very much for taking some time out of your Labor Day weekend to record this. I am currently in a closet at a beach house away from my family, which is pretty fantastic, but they're going to get restless soon. So I got to head out. Bill, you'll be back on the pod shortly, I know, and we will get you back on here as the revolution begins to pick up. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States.
Class dismissed.
President number 2 would be John Adams, and then number 3. Tom Jefferson stayed up to write the Declaration late at night, so he and his wife had a great big fight, and she made him sleep on the couch all night.
Next week, it will just be me. Sorry, guys. But we'll be jumping into the fighting with the Battle of New York, and also talking about the failed siege of Charleston, which was incredibly important in the long-term results of the Revolution. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate, please head over to the Facebook page, A Teacher of History of the United States Podcast. Find me on Twitter at A Teacher of Hist. Shoot me an email, chris@ateacherofhistory.com. And if you are so willing to support the Patreon page, that would really mean a lot to us. www.patreon.com/A Teacher of History.